Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Bruce Lascelles, President of the British Society of Soil Science, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to our second webinar of this year. Before I welcome our panelists, I would like to introduce the British Society of Soil Science as hosts of today's webinar. We're an established international membership organisation and a charity committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. We bring together those working within academia, and have a growing membership amongst practitioners implementing soil science in industry and those with a keen interest in soils. Today's event is supported by Visit Britain and Nature Scot, who are both also supporting the World Congress of Soil Science this year in 2022. For those who may not be aware, the Congress is the leading international soil science conference. It's held every 4 years in different countries and can be attended by over 3,000 soil scientists from around the globe. The next Congress will be held from the 31st of July to the 5th of August this year in Glasgow, and I'm really pleased that it's being organised by the British Society of Soil Science on behalf of the International Union of Soil Sciences. And if you're interested, have a look at our website and you can register through the Congress website as well. Nature Scot is Scotland's nature agency and work to improve the natural environment in Scotland and inspire everyone to care more about it so that all nature in Scotland is maintained, enhanced and brings us those benefits that we get from it. Nature Scot delivered an amazing exhibition stand at COP26 last year, where they highlighted the diversity of the Scottish landscape, which showed the various soil and plant types found throughout Scotland. And we're really thrilled that Nature Scot will be delivering the same exhibition at the World Congress of Soil Science later this year, and will provide delegates with an opportunity to ask their experts more about Scottish diversity. So just before we begin, some basic housekeeping. As there are so many of you here today, all your microphones have been muted. We'll be taking questions at the end of both presentations, and I've got a colleague on the call as well who's going to monitor these for us. So if you've got any questions, if you can please submit those by 12:50 so we can get through as many as we can. So coming back to Nature Scot, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Patricia Bruno, who is the Soil Science Advisor for Nature Scot, who will give us a brief introduction to Scotland's nature agency. So thank you for joining us, Patricia, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce. I think you've already got quite a lot of information I wanted to share with the audience. So I've been working for Nature Scot for a very long time as a soil advisor. Our Nature Scot, as you were saying, is a conservation agency with over 30 years experience advising Scottish government. And we work to enhance our natural environment and inspire people to care about what we're doing. And what is very clear now is that soil is driving nature and its ability to adapt and respond to climate change. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to sponsor the conference in August, because we know with the launch of our new corporate strategy yesterday, we have even a more prominent role, I think, in trying to protect and restore and value nature, and recognizing that soil is at the heart of it. So what we're going to do for the World Conference, there's the main aspect of what we're going to do is related to an exhibition that we presented at COP26 last year, which is called Nature is Climate and Climate is Nature. And we would use this as an opportunity to explain and promote nature-based solutions that benefit both nature and people. And I'm very delighted with the presentation we're having today about the Peatland of Scotland, because Peatland Restoration is one of the key activities that Nature Scot is managing. And for us, the challenge in Scotland is to try to achieve a restoration of our peatland. And I'm going to pass on now to Bruce to introduce the speakers that are going to give you a much better detail about what is happening in Scotland in relation to peatland restoration, which is one of the nature-based solutions that we're promoting. Sorry, how do I stop sharing?
Brilliant, thank you, Patricia. And again, apologies for my confusion.
No, it's okay.
of what you were going to say, and really grateful for Nature Scot's support for our events and your presence at the World Congress as well. So just coming back to some of the the housekeeping, I've covered the first 2 points. Today's presentation has also been awarded BASIS and NRO/SO CPD points. So if you're registered with either of those bodies, please contact us directly after the event. And just finally then, please be aware that we are recording today's presentation. So moving on to the main content, then I would now like to introduce our first presenter, Andrew McBride. Andrew has worked for over 30 years in nature conservation in Scotland. Whilst graduating from Edinburgh, he managed 3 nature reserves and went on to run his own environmental management consultancy for 9 years. Looking for a new challenge, he joined Nature Scot as their lowland wetland ecologist, providing advice covering planning applications, designated site monitoring, wetland management and training, and represented Scotland on several national wetland biodiversity and water-based groups, as well as offering policy advice on peat extraction, bog restoration, climate change, natural flood management, diffuse pollution and forestry on peatlands. For the last 9 years, Andrew has managed the award-winning Peatland Action project, delivering restoration to Scotland's peatlands. Andrew recently set up Land and Habitats, an environmental consultancy providing advice and assistance to companies and projects wishing to invest in the natural environment. Andrew has a wide range of land management experience covering most Scottish habitats, but his primary focus is on wetlands. Key to his work is getting practical information out to those who need it. And as chief editor, he produced the Fen Management Handbook and has made many short videos and assisted with practical management, technical and policy guidance documents. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Am I sharing my screen yet? No.
Not yet.
Yeah, we can see that, Andrew. Thank you.
You can? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You can see my screen. Fine. Okay, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for inviting me along. I'm going to talk a bit about what we've probably learned in Scotland over the last 30 years with peatland restoration. There's a lot to learn, and 20 minutes probably won't cover it at all, but I'll try and keep to the sort of key points, the things we've actually learned and what we've actually been doing. You'll see that my title of my presentation is Lessons to Learn from Peatface, and it is not lessons learned, because unfortunately history suggests that often we don't learn those, but hopefully I'm always hopeful that we can actually learn from the past, because there's a lot to learn from that. A minute. Oops. For the last 200 years, we've done our damnedest to actually drain peatlands, in this case from the 18th century, late 18th century. You can see ditches were dug, and not only ditches were dug, boreholes were put into the bottom of those ditches to actually go through the clays that were below into its more porous material to actually drain the bogs. I don't know whether this actually worked. It doesn't. There's no detail of where it was actually done, but the idea was there. And having seen mining sites under bogs, I don't think it probably actually would work. But peatlands are tremendously resistant, and often surprising what you actually come across in the field when you look at them. So I think we've done our damnedest to actually try and drain bogs, but in a lot of cases, bogs want to actually continue. Back in we started in peatland restoration in the 1980s and 1990s in Scotland, and in that time 47,000 hectares of peatland benefited from restoration measures. That's not to say that actually those restoration measures were totally effective. They were often involved minimal intervention and were mainly management changes, which meant either fencing out livestock or reducing livestock on them. And I think one of the first lessons that I learned was removing livestock from peat bogs was not necessarily the best way forward. It was very responsive to overstocking. It wasn't actually responsive to what the actual peatlands needed. The work, as I say, was very low intervention, no hard hats, reflective jackets or gloves. It was just a case of pushing in corrugated sheets or trying to make dams out of bits of wood and different things like that. There was no money available. It was always down the back of the sofa, underspend and that type of thing. So we've come quite a long way with that now, and it was a good start, but it didn't actually make a big difference to bogs. Moving on into more recent years, we've upscaled massively in Scotland, and Peatland Restaurantation has taken on a different format with big machines. With big machines come the hard hats and the reflective jackets. And a lot of this is, well, most of this is actually down to Scottish Government policy and also the advent of Peatland Action as well back in 2012. Just to give you some idea of the spread of projects from Peatland Action, the map shows the distribution. This map is back in 2020, so there's a lot more projects. The green blobs are probably more coalesced now because projects build on projects, and they're probably in the same sort of places. But a lot of work was delivered in that time, and that is mainly in response to policy changes, and particularly climate change policies, really bringing in peatland restoration as part of that package for land use, but also part of the package for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and that fortunately brought money and had consequences from that aspect of it. So we've gone a long way, particularly in the last 10 years, and we've gained a lot of experience in the time since the 1980s as well. One of the key lessons about peatland restoration is that it is all about people. The peatlands aspect of it is actually relatively easy, relatively simple. The people aspect of it is probably the most time consuming and the hardest part of peatland restoration. And particularly with policy, it is helping people understand what the problem is. We're talking about degraded peatlands, which are often remote, and most people don't actually ever see peatlands in a degraded condition. So with policy makers, what we've done and the lessons we've learned there, it's really important to actually get them out on site and look at the issues. If that means dragging chairs and tables across moorland and tea urns and goodness knows what, that's what you have to do, because you've got to get people out there. You probably need to buy a few pairs of Wellingtons as well. That makes a big difference to whatever you can do. If you haven't got that policy right, that policy setting and the finance that goes behind that policy, the rest of it is just not going to happen at all. Talking about policy though, it's actually also about integrated policy, and I think that's one of the hardest things to actually resolve. We often make policies in isolation, and peatland policy is a good example of that. It needs to be actually integrated with lots of different policies, quite strange policies. Housing policy, for example. Housing in rural communities is very difficult for people to actually live and work in the area where they're working, and those sort of policies need to be more integrated to the demand for housing for what are actually key workers in that particular circumstance. Skills base, we've started from a quite low skills base in terms of numbers. There's a lot of skill that people were doing the work, but actually it's actually scaling that up massively, so you actually get a lot of restoration done relatively quickly. And the other thing with policy is actually stretching the time limits rather than short term. You really need to have people thinking in long term. And it's interesting, I've said for quite a long time to people, we're basically restoring our peatlands, so people in the future will appreciate the fact we've saved the peatlands, but how do we know what they're actually going to do with them? They probably may need to burn them. And if you look at fuel prices going up, I can see an increase in the amount of peat harvesting actually going on for burning, particularly on the islands which rely on oil, unless something is actually done to actually encourage more electricity use, particularly from renewable energy sources. But it is relatively easy now to go and dig peat with a machine, not have to worry about midges, all these other factors, rain, all these sort of things are taken out of the equation. So it's not just a case of actually the policy we have at the moment, what's happening. We need a lot more sort of thinking ahead. On the actual restoration practice, the key thing with restoring peatlands is actually getting a grip of the water. And what gets a grip of the water on a peatland is the sphagnum moss. People do not like you calling it a sponge, but it is a sponge, and it is a sphagnum moss that actually keeps the water on peatland, particularly on degraded peatland, and kickstarts it into the next process where it becomes a more active peatland. And the comparison with a sponge is a valid one, I feel, because a sponge, yes, it holds water, and then it will only hold so much water. Sphagnum moss is the same. It will only hold a certain amount of water, but it delays that flow of water, and it holds 20 times its dry weight in water, which a sponge is about 6 or 7 times. So there are differences, but it really is key to everything that you do in restoration. You've got to be thinking, how are we going to get sphagnum to grow here, and how are we going to get to proliferate? This is a good example of from about 25 years ago, actually, of what we actually used to do with blocking ditches. You can see the ditch on the left. That's before it was blocked, and then it was blocked using plastic piling. We reduced the amount of plastic piling we use now for specific purposes. But what we did at that time, we were slightly scared about holding too much water, and we tended to actually just hold water up to a certain level, and it never got that the surfaces became wet, and the wetness just sort of was focused around the ditches. What we actually do now is spread the water right from the top of that ditch that you're actually seeing there right across the whole area, and that way you actually are providing conditions for the sphagnum moss, not just around the ditch, but you're actually providing those conditions over a much larger area. You're going to get restoration much quicker, and from a climate point of view, getting carbon sequestration, and also actually sealing the surface up with a good cover of sphagnum moss as well. I'm a great advocate of learning by doing, and a lot of what we did in Peatland Action is just going out there and trying different things. If you don't try, you'll never actually find out. Very often, if you have to wait till it's been a full experiment or whatever's actually had to be done, or the research has actually been done, is getting too late now. We need to actually respond quickly. This is an example of a place called Blood Moss down in Dumfries and Galloway on Forest Land, Scotland land, and they did some of the first mulching, whole tree mulching on a bog. There was a raised bog. And when you went to the site after it had been mulched, it was just phenomenal. It was just horrendous. It was just mulch, a thick layer of mulch everywhere, no plants, nothing. And about 3 years later, the slide on the left, things had started to grow where the tracks had sunk in. You would actually get sphagnum moss coming into those pools. I went back there about 6 years ago, and that's what you see is on the right-hand side. You've still got all the chips and the bits of wood in the ditches. You can see the water's quite close to the surface there, but the sphagnum cover is just completely over the whole of the moss, and you've actually got an active bog reforming. And it's, on the face of it, if you looked at what we saw at the beginning, you would think this is not going to be a success. And it is actually, just by going and doing it, you can actually get relatively quick results or an idea of what actually is going to happen. Another lesson that I've learned is also about go in heavy and go in now. If you think about it, a lot of the peatlands that we have were originally drained using heavy machinery, and when they were drained initially, they probably looked an absolute mess. We have to probably go in and do much the same, and you will lose certain biodiversity, but we've got good techniques now, we've got good operators, and we've got better machines as well with much lower ground pressure. And it's really important to kickstart peatlands off. We fiddled around at the edges for far too long on them, rather than actually going in there, getting the water table right, doing it on large enough areas. Now we know more what we actually need to do. And I think the other thing is, it's about doing it now, because what we found in the past is by not doing something, we have lost that interest. We have lost time, we've lost bog, we've lost carbon, we've lost any of the benefits that we could have had over the last 20 or 30 years by not actually having the confidence to actually go in and doing it. Now, that doesn't mean to say it works every time, but most times it actually does work, and we learn from when we don't actually, it's not successful. Seeing the bigger picture, as I was saying about integration of policy, it's not just about peatlands. You have to think about woodlands, you have to think bog woodlands, grasslands, heathland, the lot, rivers. If we think in that way, we can actually integrate projects to produce much better outcomes rather than just a peatland restoration project. We can have a peatland restoration, wetland complex, river restoration complex. All these things should be fitting together, not in just isolated aspects. And that, I think, is one of the key things where the most gains can come in the future. And that's one thing that I've learned from that. How we actually do resource planning is interesting. It's very target driven, and that leads to sort of short-termism. And I think that's when you're talking about bogs, we're talking 1,000 years old, more than thousands of years. You're actually should be looking at process, and the process of how that integrates with other systems as well, not just one system. You've got to think about valuing people as well, because people are part of that system, but also valuing our soil resources. And also when we want to develop, look at the true costs of that development. Now, investing in people is one of the key things that we actually have learned that we need to do, and we need to do it quickly to actually scale up, to actually get the restoration done on the ground. And there's Emily here from the Carbon Crime Centre working for Peatland Action, doing lots of training across Scotland, but it's actually taking that training to the people who actually need it in a location that's relatively close to them. It's not about drawing people, because most of the people who are doing this work are actually living where they can. They live in relatively remote areas. So Peatland Action have been doing quite a lot of work on actually doing that. Going back to the valuing resources, it isn't just about people knowing what to do. It's do we actually learn, and do we act on that learning? The slide on the left, when I first visited that, I thought, has this been the first road that we've ever built? Not to know what happens when you dig ditches and have mud around on the site, because it's almost like going back to basics sometimes when you go onto a site and you think, have we progressed? And when you look at the advert on the right, you think, well, it does suggest that we perhaps haven't progressed if that sort of attitude is actually being promoted, that I can do what I want, I can drive and I can treat the soil how I want. And I think that's a big factor. We need to actually change the attitudes of people on soil and on the value of soil as well. Using our resource again, are we making the same mistakes? This photograph is back in the 1980s, which you'll all know. Large areas of Scotland were planted up, and peatlands particularly were planted up with conifers. Quite a few of those conifers, more recently, have blown down. The interesting question will be, and they're growing on deep peat, will we replant on those areas? That will be, I'll leave that open, because that's something that I think I'm keen to watch and see what actually happens. Also, wind farms in development as well. Are we actually getting what we ask for in planning conditions and different things like that? I think in most cases, yes, we are, but there are some outstanding cases where we don't get what we're actually asking for, and that is partly because there's no particular follow-up on actually making sure that we get what we ask for. And sometimes that comes back to people not always knowing what to ask for, and ask for it quite strongly until you actually get it. This is an example here. Would you like to see this or this? This or this for a drain? I think you probably all agree that the latter is what we're actually looking for. So I think it's a case of actually making sure we know what we want and actually pushing for that from a soil point of view, a peat point of view, whatever we're actually looking at, and making it clear how to actually achieve that, because sometimes we have to fill in the gaps on that, and that's where the learning by doing often actually helps a lot. So finally, the lessons I'm learning, because I haven't finished learning either. I think being prepared to change is a big thing that you always need to do, and we using common sense a lot of the time. That's probably about the best you're actually going to get, is being able to use just common sense, because the facts aren't always there. The facts will follow up, and hopefully they will confirm what you're actually thinking from using your experience, your knowledge, and other scientific experience as well. But key to doing a lot of this is actually keeping it simple. We, as humans, we seem to make things very, very complicated. Peatland restoration need not be complicated at all. It is actually relatively simple. It's about looking after sphagnum moss, looking at how that will actually, the conditions that it will actually grow in, and creating those conditions. And I think one thing that we're often guilty of is not asking for more in the environment. And I think that's changed quite a lot, actually. I think people are willing to give more, which is absolutely fantastic. But we still should ask for more than we think we actually need, because inevitably you won't get all that you want. And I think the key thing in this time of climate change is you have to do it now. I was speaking to a site manager, and she had been waiting 17 years for a whole set of data to be analysed and collected, and she said, well, actually, I'm only going to advise the same thing to do now as I was going to do 17 years ago. And I think, well, isn't that a shame? We could have had 17 years worth of peatlands being restored rather than actually having to wait 17 years. So that's my reflections on the sort of lessons we've learned and where we've got to in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a fantastic presentation and a great set of takeaway messages at the end, and particularly that concept of learning by doing and acting now and not waiting. I agree totally. We've waited a long time thinking about things and running things through our minds, and I think we just need to get on and do it and learn from that doing as well. But thank you very much. Hopefully you're all thinking of questions that you'd like to ask at the end, and we'll come back to the questions at the end of the session. So our next speaker is Dr. Rebekka Artz. Rebekka is a senior scientist at the James Hutton Institute. She leads the Restoration and Adaptive Management team and delivers interdisciplinary projects on a wide range of land use matters with teams across various institutions and in co-construction with policy. She was the co-investigator on a BEIS-funded work to implement peatland emissions reporting in the UK National Inventory and led the derivation of UK-specific emissions factors and area estimates, which were the source of data for calculation of peatland mitigation potential in the Committee on Climate Change's 2019 Net Zero Assessment Report. She's presented research at COP25 in Madrid in Chile and COP26 in Glasgow. She also led Hutton components within Scotland's Centre for Expertise on Climate Change between 2017 and 2021, and is currently on part-time secondment to lead the technical advice team within Nature Scot Peatland Action. She's a principal investigation for the Mothership NERC Large Grant, which runs from this year to 2027, and the RESAS Strategic Research Programme Centipede project, which again runs over the same time period. So over to you, Rebekka.
For some reason, my screen share option has disappeared. I don't know if the organisers could change that again. Ask for that again, please. Right. Okay, I couldn't have asked for a better introduction than Andrew's talk and Patricia's earlier, because mine is probably a slightly different take on the very same topic. So while I'm currently working with Nature Scot Peatland Action for part of my time, or in fact half of my time at the moment as well, to deliver peatland restoration, my long-term job, if you like, through the James Hutton Institute has been more providing the scientific evidence in terms of current condition of peatlands and how we might better manage them in future and monitor the effects of changes in peatland management. So this isn't entirely Scotland focused, because the remit of my job and the team of people that I work with is more of an eventually global reach. So this is effectively a journey into peatlands through space and time as well. So a quick introduction to why our small and Scottish and UK peatlands are in fact globally important. As you can see here, peatlands are the world's most amazing terrestrial carbon source, because they have very slowly but surely squirreled away carbon at a rate of 0.04 to 1 gigatons of carbon. So they are now containing almost a third of all the global soil carbon in general. So in their natural states, peatlands would be carbon sinks, but unfortunately they are now a major carbon source due to regional drainage and land conversion. And the two worst offending areas are Western Europe, including the UK and Scotland, and also Southeast Asia. So the picture that we're looking at now is, rather than peatlands globally being a net sink of carbon and thereby helping to combat climate change, they're actually a net contributor. And that is due to 10% of the peatland area globally being drained only. And that's flipped the entire global carbon sink into a net source to the tune of 5% of all anthropogenic emissions, which is quite astonishing, really. So to give you some simple numbers, most of you will know this, to stay within our 1.5 degree target globally of warming, the remaining carbon budget has now been estimated as between 230 and 440 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And those were 2020 numbers, so we've already depleted that at some rate. And the rate currently is that we're probably still emitting around 60 gigatons of carbon dioxide globally per year, steadily declining, but still not good news. And the UK emissions component of that is nearly half of a gigaton. So when you think about the land area of the UK in global terms, that's not good news. And when you basically then drill this down to the peatlands component, for the UK total, peatland emitted 13.7 megatons in 2019, which actually excludes the forestry sector, which may or may not be a net carbon sink in the short term. But that figure is astonishing. We are a very peat-rich nation, both within Scotland and also within the UK to a lesser degree when you look at the distribution of peatlands, and that peatland should not be a carbon source. And especially if we're looking at the pathways that we do have in relation to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, ideally without any overshoot, we really need to look at emissions peaking very soon and reaching net zero by the early 2050s. And of course, both Scotland and the UK have now legal instruments to try and get us to that, ideally even before the 2050 target. So as was introduced in the introduction for this talk, I've been part of a team that compiled the emission factors for peatlands to report on in the UK greenhouse gas inventory. And since 2019, these figures have now been used to report on both the current emissions and progress in terms of reducing peatland carbon emissions. And I won't go into too much detail because of the time here, but what you can see here is that there are several component parts that make up the net losses from peatlands. And the blue bars here are the losses through carbon dioxide. And so you can see from just the size of the bars, the top bars are the near natural state where the blue is effectively in the negative, and you see the same for re-wetted sites. So those are carbon dioxide sinks, but some of that uptake is offset by losses of methane and other components of the net carbon flux. The more degraded your peatland through land cover conversion, drainage, and in the worst case, conversion to grassland or even cropland, the stronger the net carbon dioxide emissions are. And then on top of that, there are also, in terms of intensive land use, other parts of that carbon equation, such as dissolved organic carbon, particulate organic carbon in their areas in particular, and also nitrous oxide emissions and emissions of methane from the ditches. So these add up. So the same data reimagined and now with the errors added. So these are the uncertainties in each of the emission factors compiled in quadrature. If you look at the total carbon budget for peatlands under different condition and land cover categories, it's only the near natural sites that we can say with reasonable confidence are currently either net sinks or probably, statistically speaking, not different from zero in terms of their carbon accumulation. All others, apart from re-wetted fens, are currently very much net sources of carbon dioxide. So you can then use these figures to look at potential abatement if these areas were restored. So on a per hectare basis, as you can see here, again, adding up all the uncertainties in the data, it gets quite messy. But to the best of our knowledge at the moment, and these data are actually still being worked on and updated on an annual basis, we see that pretty much any re-wetting of peatlands gives statistically valid abatement potential, possibly with the exception of modified bogs, so very mildly converted bogs, where actually our data sources are still quite sparse. So the jury is still a little bit out on that one. And one thing that I need to add to this is that where we haven't assumed here that abatement potential means subtracting the net emissions from degraded bog, with those of a near natural site, we've actually, with these assessments, looked at the most likely scenario. So going from cropland to the re-wetted state rather than cropland to intact, because against the 2045 or 2050 target, it's probably not feasible to restore back to the carbon sink function of a near natural site. So these figures already include a very cautious approach in terms of assessing abatement potential. So this then leads on to using peatland restoration as part of the suite of methods to achieve net zero. So as also Andrew has introduced, this is going forward at great speed, and as Patricia showed, needs to be speeded up rapidly as well to achieve net zero. We're talking about probably in excess of 1 million hectares of peatland in Scotland alone that is in need of some form of re-wetting or restoration. And so we need to really speed this up rapidly. But we also need to show that restoration produces robust outcomes. And Andrew has shown some very great examples of the interim outcomes, which is fantastic. So I will also show some further of the ongoing research programs here. So just as a brief interlude, I'll delve a little bit into more of the science about how we measure specifically carbon emissions. So with the exception of the aqueous losses of carbon, which is shown in these little bottles here, where we are measuring the colour of water effectively by looking at dissolved organic carbon concentrations and converting that to a flux by measurements of the amount and volumes of water and the timing of the water flow. The rest of the gaseous emissions are frequently measured with a variety of techniques, but the gold standard really here are these systems, which colloquially are called flux towers, but these really utilize a method called the eddy covariance technique. And effectively what this is, it's utilizing the fact that changes in conditions in air movement produce a certain amount of turbulence. And this turbulence, as you can see here, produces effectively eddies of upward and downward moving air parcels. And these air parcels carry carbon dioxide or methane or nitrous oxide, if that's what you're measuring on site. So if you've got an instrument at a fixed point in relation to the movement of airflow, if you've got a fast measuring instrument, it can measure basically the side of these eddies and decide whether the air is moving downward or upward, and by that you can then determine the flux. So because the instrument is in one particular point in space and your air movement is three-dimensional, we're not measuring the same location in space at all times. So what we're measuring is effectively a footprint, which varies through time in 3D. So that's the kind of exciting bit, that we can measure different parcels of a landscape. So just to show you where we're at the moment, this is a map of the current greenhouse gas monitoring network using flux towers, and that's the most up-to-date situation. So at present there are 10 eddy covariance flux towers on peatland already in place. As of last week, we've received news that there will be another 3 added to this, so this will probably add to fill some of the spatial undersampling in this map. And also we are working with further partners who are also adding potentially 2 other towers to these locations, predominantly in the central belt and in the southwest of Scotland. Because this is quite expensive kit, this is actually a consortium effort between a number of organisations, as you can see here on the right. And where this data then also feeds into is into a larger European and ultimately global network of flux tower sites. So you can see there in the image on the right, the representation of monitoring locations in relation to the climate regions across Europe. So in the green is the oceanic temperate zone, of course, which is heavily represented by the UK and Ireland and other parts of more temperate Europe. And then we move into the blue temperate zone and the dark blue greyish areas of the boreal, and then into the orange and yellows. We're more into tropical types of climates. And of course, these are ever changing. So what this network also allows us to do is to look at climate change. as I said, there is, and also as others have mentioned before, there are often indicators that we can use of potential net losses of carbon dioxide and methane. And I was involved in a synthesis of work to look at the potential drivers of carbon dioxide and methane losses. And this was published last year in Nature, where we showed that when you look at these very sort of gold standard sites of eddy covariance measurements, there is very strong indication that over the medium term, at least when we're looking at kind of multi-year data sets, that there's a linear relationship of the losses of carbon dioxide relative to the net losses. Sorry, there's a linear relationship between the annual water table depth and the net losses of carbon dioxide. And there's an inverse relationship between the water table depth and methane losses, which is also non-linear. So in that large graph in the middle, what you can see is if you superimpose the two. So the green line is the carbon dioxide losses, which increase as you drain a site, and in orange is the line for methane. And methane losses increase the more inundated a site is. And then the black line basically uses those two in combination. And as you can see, there's a kind of sweet spot around 5 to 10 centimeters below the water, below the surface of a peatland, where it's just right. And in net terms, you've got a carbon sink for the combined balance of carbon dioxide and methane. And of course, there are small additional elements, as we showed earlier, of DOC, POC, and other factors potentially. But that's usually roughly the sweet spot. The issue is what we don't yet know is how stable that sweet spot is, and how whether there are regional differences in relation to local climatic factors that influence that sweet spot. So this is effectively a synthesis of temperate regions, and might need a lot more work to disentangle that for local specific locations. So just to briefly introduce in the last few minutes I've got, where all of this monitoring network comes in is into two major new 5-year projects, which are respectively funded by NERC, UKRI, which is the Mothership project, and also by the research division within Scottish Government, which is the Centipede project. And although the Flux Tower network effectively delivers to both of these projects, they have slightly different focus. So the Mothership project is very much about large-scale modelling and developing models, and the focus here is on the resilience of peatlands in relation to climate change. So at the moment we have fairly short data series from most of these sites, but we can already see, for example, here that in drought years following, for example, the 2018 example here, sites have a tendency to flip into a more carbon emitting state, and the longer term observations that we will be able to gather here in this project in relation to already existing data, will be able to interrogate in relation to drought frequencies in a little bit more detail, and use these to parameterize various models. The Centipede project, on the other hand, focuses very much on Scottish peatlands, and what we will look at here is the transitions. So at the moment, most of the data series that we have are from sites that have been in a static state of land use or land cover, and very few stations so far have looked at the transition, especially post re-wetting. So what we are looking at here is basically the change between the top and the bottom state, which at the moment we're not yet capturing. So these graphs actually show the kind of cumulative amount of carbon dioxide in sites. So the top one is kind of reflective of a moderately drained site, where in some years it's accumulating carbon, and some years it's losing a little more carbon. But over the longer term period, it's effectively around about zero in terms of net accumulation, whereas the bottom plot really shows you a strongly accumulating intact site. So in cumulative terms, that's how peatlands work. They're slow but steady accumulation locations. So what we're going to do with these data is not just related to carbon, although this has been a very carbon focused talk so far. Effectively, both of these projects with slightly different spatial remits are looking at the whole complement of resilience. It's not just about the exchange of carbon, it's also about water and energy dynamics, so how these sites function under drought conditions, under extreme weather conditions the other direction, and also in the longer term with global warming. And all of these projects are augmented with a number of Earth observations and also on-site hydrological measurements and modelling of elements such as Andrew mentioned, the distribution of water across the sites and off the sites. So there are also aspects of modelling the lateral flow of water within and off each peatland location at different spatial scales, of course. And so, as I finally alluded to, both of these projects are also aiming to build better and more robust peatland model representations. And although the proof is in the pudding on site, we don't always have the resources to do everything everywhere. So this is where models can come in handy. So within the Mothership project, we're aiming to develop the UK land surface model JULES. That also then feeds into Earth systems models and ultimately into the likes of IPCC assessments, so we can really look at potential management interventions and their impact on the long-term resilience of peatlands in the long term, in global terms, not just the UK. And in a Scottish context, we will use a more process-based model called DNDC to fine-tune the differences between bioclimatically different regions across Scotland. So I'll just, as a quick warning, and this comes back to Andrew's mention of going heavy and going now. So coming back to the start of my talk, we know that we only have a very small remaining carbon budget to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I'm an optimist and I have a child, and so I'd like to say we can do this. But the consequences of not doing this and not staying within 1.5 degrees it's horrendous for humanity as a whole. It's also horrendous for peatlands. So at the moment, we're working on slightly out of date projections, but this is work that we're picking up, for example, in the Mothership project with our project partners. That's to look at the fate of peatlands in the UK and also in Europe. European peatlands alone store 42 gigatons of carbon. The Scottish peatlands store 3.5 gigatons of carbon. If you put that against the globally remaining carbon budget, it's not good news. If you look at the projections with admittedly out of date UK CP climate scenarios, you can see a distinct potential for the available space for peatlands disappearing. So these images don't show disappearance of peatlands per se, but they show disappearance of the conditions for peatlands to form. So we are really racing against time, and so that's why I wanted to stop. We know we've got to put diggers on peatlands and they use fossil fuel, but it does come back to what Andrew mentioned. So if we don't do this now, we're running out of time, and I have run out of time. So I'll just summarise saying, this is what our work contributes: global efforts to understand current and future losses of carbon from peatlands, the national efforts to calculate emission savings potential, verifying also carbon credit schemes, for example, the Peatland Code, and then ultimately global efforts to model the future fate of peatlands. So I have to give credit to an enormous team of people here who are part of these projects. So that's just briefly showing them all. And with that, I would like to say thank you, and I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you very much, Rebekka. That was a fantastic follow-on from Andrew's presentation, and I think those two presentations together really do hit that message home that we need to do something now, and this is a fantastic resource, but ultimately a critical resource to get right in the future. So thank you both very much for those. I'm pleased now to welcome Izzy Lloyd, who is one of our early career committee members. Izzy's been monitoring the questions you've been sending in. It's 12:50 now, so hopefully you've got all your questions in, and hopefully, Izzy, you've got time to get through as many of them as possible. So I'll hand over to you, Izzy, now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we've had loads of questions in the chat, so that's great. Thank you everyone for sending them in, and thank you again, Rebekka and Andrew. They were really fab presentations. I'm going to start with this one that's come through during Andrew's talk, but Rebekka, of course, if it applies to you as well, please feel free to respond. So the question is, are there any implications for restoring peatlands directly after a tree felling event? For example, if you were transforming forestry to a bog, whereas normally peatlands would be left alone for about 3 years. So are there any kind of differences in those scenarios?
Yeah, there is. I think what we found from the point of view, it depends on the crop growth. If the crop growth has been good, then you need to actually leave it for a while to start the roots actually breaking down. If the crop growth has been poor, it's very easy to actually go in there. And I think one of the techniques that I didn't talk about was stump inversion. We've done a lot more of that more recently, and the results that have come from doing that have been quite outstanding. They're just completely staggering. Again, it's a bit like the mulching. You look at it and you think crumbs is never going to come back, but within a year you start seeing signs of bog vegetation. So I think it's often it's quite difficult to actually say. I think one of the things that people concerns people with, like the mulching particularly, and also felling trees as well, is what is the outputs from that, from the point of view of soil nutrients being lost. But again, I don't think there's been probably enough research done on that, but I suspect a lot of what's there is actually locked up, because like the picture I showed, when you dug down below, the wood was in perfect condition underneath that sphagnum. So I suspect the acid conditions, the higher water table, and this comes back to about hitting sites hard, because if you have a water table that's fluctuating, as Rebekka was saying with the methane, that's when you start getting much more methane production. I'll stop there, let Rebekka say something.
Yeah, have you got anything to add on that, Rebekka?
Not much to add, other than yes, it's likely that there's immobilization of a lot of these nutrients, especially if you do manage to get the water table up quite rapidly. And what a lot of these sites have is quite a depleted microbial biomass. Especially if there's been a long-term change in land use preceding a change, so they're ready and waiting to immobilize nutrients.
Mm-hmm. Oh, brilliant. I had another question, which again could go to either of you, in the chat, saying, is there any work underway, or are there any plans to engage government bodies and the Scotch Whisky Association to drive a change in the usage of peat in the whisky industry? I don't know who's best to take that one.
I'll answer that, because I actually I'm working for a whiskey company at the moment, and yes, it's very much high on the agenda, and they already have looked at how much peat they use and using that peat efficiently, and the long-term way that peat is harvested, and also peatland restoration as well. So certain companies within the Scottish whisky industry are already doing that and establishing sites where peatland restoration is taking place, and looking at the whole process, because like for all industries, it's not just about one aspect of what you're actually doing, it's the whole carbon aspect of any business.
We had a question through during your talk, Rebekka, regarding the greenhouse gas emissions. So someone's asked, the biggest losses of greenhouse gas emissions from peat appear to be from intensively managed areas that are under crop and intensive grassland. And the person is asking if most of these sites are outside Scotland.
So yes, to a degree, the worst offenders, if you like, in terms of net emissions are outside of Scotland. But what is important to note is the relative area. So while Scotland may not have that much cropland on peat or intensive grassland on peat, what is prevalent is the kind of intermediate degradation area. So we have around 300,000 hectares of eroded peatland. We've got probably a few tens of thousands of extensive grassland, possibly. We also have a very, very large area of formerly drained and now quite heather dominated or grass dominated peatlands. So these numbers add up. So while the multiplier is perhaps not as large as the area, that is very large.
I've got another question that's actually my question, again regarding the greenhouse gas emissions. I was just wondering, kind of how soon after beginning a restoration process do you expect to see a change in emissions? Is it quite sudden or a lengthy process?
So this is where one of the big data gaps is. So I think, as I said in the talk, most of the monitoring has been carried out on sites that are either already converted or are still in the starting condition. So this is kind of where some of our efforts are now concentrated in really fleshing that out. From the data we've looked at so far, there is a suggestion that the change is quite rapid. So the very early restoration years we have relatively few data on, but there's a reasonable body of evidence for data that are 3 years or older post-restoration, and those are the emissions settle down very quickly. The exception is where a lot of biomass has been put onto the site, either the brash material from forestry, for example. So that takes a little while to decompose, and there may be a 5-year period during which that brash decomposition adds a little bit to the emissions burden. But yeah, the question people often ask is, what about methane? Do you get a lot of methane, transient methane losses? And the answer is we don't know for sure, but there isn't a very strong evidence for exceptionally high methane losses, except for when the site water table isn't managed very well. So if you see sites that are completely flooded, yes, then you do see a lot of methane emissions. And if there's kind of fluctuating temporary inundation, those sites tend to also be quite high in net methane emissions, and that can flip the net budget, even under rewetting, back into a net carbon emitting site.
Oh wow, amazing, really interesting. We've had a good question, which I think is maybe a nice one to end on, because we are coming up to time now. And again, an open one for both of you. Is there a capacity building platform where aspiring young scientists can have information and learn about peatland restoration? And I suppose we could extend that question to just anybody who's interested. So I'll start with you, Andrew. Have you got any good resources that you could direct people towards if they want to know more?
I think I would direct people to the Peatland Action website, because it has got a very wide range of information. It's got information about restoration techniques, it's got contact details, it's also got access to their training that they do as well. So I think that is a very good resource. Brilliant.
Have you got any, Rebekka, before we wrap up?
I was going to say the same, but I was also going to take it away with me as an action point. So with another hat on, there are two bodies that effectively sit around the table, and which include all of the major stakeholders in this. So the National Peatland Plan Group includes the major policy makers, Scottish whisky industry, etc. But there's also a smaller team, which is the National Peatland Research and Management Group, and it might be an interesting one if we see if there's a series of resources that could be compiled that way. Because yeah, I was going to say the same. Peatland Action is probably the easiest route in.
Brilliant, definitely one for everybody to check out. But it looks like we've only got a minute left, so I'm going to hand back to Bruce to wrap up and just say thank you again for both of your talks. They're fantastic.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Izzy. So yeah, so just finally, on behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I would like to express our thanks to Andrew and Rebekka for coming along to present today on a fantastic topic, and to yourself, Izzy, for coordinating the Q&A session. And also thank you to Visit Britain and Nature Scot for supporting this webinar, and for Patricia's introduction at the start. And thank you to all for attending. You'll find a quick feedback survey when you leave the webinar, which we hope you'll find time to complete, because the information and feedback you give does help us to fine-tune these going forward. The recording of this session will be available after the event on our YouTube channel. And during this year, we're running 8 Zoom into Soil webinars, and the next one is taking place on Wednesday, the 4th of May. And it'll look at how soils are a record of our past. So again, another very interesting topic coming up. And that webinar is now available for registration via our website, and we'll also send a link out in our follow-up email. So just to end, I hope to see you at future events, and in the meantime, thank you again and goodbye.